Hey, and welcome back to the Woodgrafter. Today we're starting a two-part mini-series looking at the design and construction of this Bessey clamp rack. That sounds good? Stick around. Now, like most of us, when we first start getting into woodworking, we realise that we need some clamps, and we go away and we research clamps with best intentions, and we realise they're very expensive things. So we tend to build up a larger collection of relatively cheap clamps, and that puts us on, and does most of us, for a long period of time. Now, here's the clamp collection I've been using up until this point. The problem is they're getting a bit old now, they're tired, they're not functioning, they let me down when I need them most, so it's time for a bit of an upgrade. Bessey clamps are some of the best in the market, allegedly, so I ordered a couple of Bessey clamps to have a play with them, really like them, so I've re-kitted out my entire collection now with Bessey clamps. Now, there's a lot of money invested in my clamp collection, and I wanted a home to keep them in, hence wanting to build a clamp rack for the clamps. I looked around on the internet, and in full disclosure, I came across a guy called Timothy Wilmots over at Benchworks, and I'll leave a link to his site and to his video in the description below. Now, the reason I shout out for him is the design I'm using is pretty much the design that Timothy Wilmots came up with, but I'm not into plagiarism, and I got in touch with Timothy and said, hey, I want to build a clamp rack and it's going to be heavily influenced by your design. Are you okay if I make this video? And he got in touch and said, yeah, not a problem. Now, interesting, if you go over to Benchworks, you'll see he's not made any videos on YouTube for a fair few years now. And I asked Timothy, why is that? He's actually retired from the world of woodworking and he now runs a farm over in Belgium, I think, and he's enjoying himself immensely. But it's still left us with some great videos, some great content, and some great designs, such as the one we're going to look at. So I'll stop waxing lyrically, let's go and look at this clamp rack and see why I'm so excited by it. Come on. And here it is, my Bessey clamp rack. And first thing you'll notice, it's got a lot of clamps inside it. Great use of space in my small workshop. In fact, this is just about 1.1 metres long. They're about half a metre, just over half a metre high. And inside it, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 of these Bessey parallel clamps in a variety of different sizes. I've also got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 of these quick clamps that I love so much once I started to use them. And I've got room for a further 16 G clamps that I've not yet managed to afford, but they're coming soon. The top of the rack here, I've got the accessories. So I've got 4 of these clamps that allow me to clamp 2 of the parallel clamps together to give me long length of clamps, and also the jaws for the parallel clamps as well that allow me to do odd shape clamping that will become useful for some projects I've got lined up. So let's dive straight in and have a look how we made this thing. So as always, the project starts with some stock. Now, this stock was actually recycled from my old hand tool workbench. I'm not sure if you remember that from very, very early on in the Woodgrafter. But when I built this bench, the hand tool bench was no longer required. So I dismantled it and I just put the material on one side for later use. And this is later use. So what you're seeing here is the top all sliced up. It was about 1.4 metres long. It's about 700 millimetres wide and about 90 millimetres thick. So a fair amount of stock, all laminated up by hand in a previous life. So all I've done is I've sliced that top up, cut it to length, and I've milled it down, so this stock is actually now oversized. It's 20 millimetre thick. So the next thing I want to do on the design is to make these panels, to glue up these panels. And I've got a glue up here, a glue up here, a glue up here, a glue up on the top one, quite a big glue up on the back there, and then these are just single pieces of stock. So next job, let's glue some panels up. I have created a simple cut list here at the back, and you can see I've started to work out what I need. So the first job is I'm going to do the end panel, the right panel, and the center panel, which are these vertical pieces here. Length is 772 and the overall width is 173. Now, 2 of these jointed together in some way is going to give me a width of around about 185, so I've got enough stock inside there to joint it. I've actually moved to these chalk pens. You can see it here. They don't tend to rub off with your hand, but they come off quite easily with a bit of water or sanding. So you can be the left panel, I think, and I'm going to do you in that orientation, and we'll just put a 1 in there to keep them together. Now I need to joint this edge where these two boards mate up, but I'm only going to do that on this edge. I'm not too worried about these edges. So the way I'll do that, I'll fold these together like a book, like so, and I want to join that edge there. And I'll go ahead and join both these faces together by taking it through the machine, because that just takes out any inconsistencies in my planer jointer setup. So working both together, these two faces here, you can see I've still got my marks that we just made, so I know what I'm doing. Simply a matter of jointing this face. There we go, a few minutes later on, we've got 3 boards that will now join together. Now you might notice on the end here, there's a couple of small gaps. It will clamp out a little bit, but some of these won't clamp out. I only need a length of 772. These boards are nominally 1.1 meters. So 772 is about there. It's about that sort of length. So I'm going to take that out of the middle of the boards. Now, because I know that, I've not got to worry about these gaps, because that will take more stock off this joint line here. And these are pretty close to where they need to be. This is now 179, and I need a width of 173 for the design. So I'm good to go. So I'm going to glue these up. So those new Bessey clamps make that job a lot easier than the old clamps that I had, so I'm pretty happy with that. So I'll get the next lot done and then we'll look at the next part. So everything's out of the clamps. Now these are straight out of the clamps, and I must confess the glue up's gone incredibly well. So those Bessey clamps are a huge difference from the way I was using it. So yes, expensive, but I think that consistent pressure has really made a difference, and these are going to take minimal cleanup. Now normally at this point I'll bring them down to that final 18 millimeters, cleaning up all these surfaces, but because this is so flat, I'm going to do it slightly different. What I'm going to do is to bring these down to the right width now and the right length, and then I'll run them through the sanding machine to bring them down to the thickness that I want. Next job, I'm going to rip all these to the right width. So in terms of the rip cuts and bringing everything down to the correct width with the correct angles on it, that is now complete. The next job is I want to bring these down to the final length before I take them over to the sanding machine to bring them down to the final 18 millimeters I'm looking for. Now I could drop these onto the miter saw, but I want everything to be the same length, and my overall length of the longest pieces is 1,200 millimeters. Now I've not yet built my miter saw station that's going to go into this part of the workshop. One day, another project on the list. So it's going to be hard to do those 1,200 repeatable lengths. I'd have to jury rig something over here on the left hand side to actually give me that repeatable cut. So I'm going to go back to my favourite tool in the shop, the track saw. Now if you follow the channel for a while, you know I've got a cutting station set up on my workbench for just this occasion, and that gives me about a 2.2 metre capacity of cut. Longer if I take out the drawers, which I do now and then, but this is more than enough. With the fence and the track, everything comes out at 90 degrees. And I can make it repeatable by just putting stops on the end of the bench. So I'm going to go ahead and use my track station for this one. But if you've got a miter saw station, it's probably a quicker option, not necessarily better, but certainly a quicker option. So I'm going to set up my cutting station and we'll get some cuts done here. Spin over my stock, same reference edge against the fence. Bring in the flag stop, bring that back, make my next cut. So everything's now at the right thickness, it's all at the right length, it's all at the right width. So now we'll just start looking at the joinery. Now I'm actually going to cut the housing dados into these panels before I cut the shape onto the panels. That's just going to make it easier if I've got two parallel surfaces to work to. So I'm interested in the left panel, the centre panel and the right panel. And you can see that on each piece I've got to cut 1, 2, 3 dados. Now everything is lined up to be exactly the same. In order to get this working, I'm going to use the router, the track saw, and my fence here, and that's going to give me repeatability. What's important is once you've cut these, everything lines up perfectly, otherwise your shelves will be at a bit of a slope and we don't want that. So I'll just start off with the dimensions on the left panel. So here's my piece of stock, 155mm wide, and for kicks I'm just going to say that this edge here is the back edge, the piece that's going to go against the wall, or the piece that's not got the curve on the diagram. I'm going to come down 100mm, and then I'm going to make a 19 and a bit millimeter dado across the stock that's 130mm long. Now if you're wondering why it's 19mm in width, it's because I'm using Velcro mat, and Velcro mat is 19 and a bit millimeters, so I'll find a router bit for the size of that stock. Obviously if you're using thinner stock, 18 or even 12 would work, make your dado accordingly. In terms of thickness on that dado, I want to come down a third of the stock, so we'll come down 18mm, which is this stock, divided by 3, which is about a 6mm depth, and that's going to make it nice and strong for us. Left piece, centre piece, and the right piece. So I'm just going to mark up the back first of all, just so I've got a reference piece. And I'm going to mark up the top so I know where I'm working from. I just want to check that these two edges here on all these stock are actually square. In theory they should be, but it's always worthwhile checking, and yep, I'm happy enough with that. So I want to come down 100mm on each of these, which is going to be there, there, there. On the centerpiece, that's my back, that's my top. We get a dado on both sides, so 100 is there. And we want our dado on this top piece to come in 130 long, which is there. Now just before I go much further, I just want to mark these up a little bit. So this is going to be left inside face. This one is centre left face. This is going to be centre right face. And this one is right inside face. And that's just so I know, so when I've got these things set up, obviously I want to make sure that all the joinery is in the right place and lines up, otherwise we've got problems. I'm just checking for accuracy. I want to make sure that this edge here is 90 degrees to my fence. So I'm just going to come in with my big precision triangle and lock everything into place. Now we know that this dado is going to be 19mm, so I want to come down half of 19mm from this line to give me the centre point of that cut, which is going to be 9.5mm. Let me show you the setup. I'm using the MFT rail and I'm using the fence, and that allows me to just use a flag stop that you might just be able to see here in the back to make sure everything lines up. Now this technique only works if all your stock is exactly the same length, and if it is, this technique works well. And our stock is the same length because we went to pains to make sure it was. So I just use the marks that we've made purely as a reference point. I'm using my Festool router, and I've set up the centre point mark that we made to the centre point of the router, so I know that's going to come out in the right place. I've got a support on the front so this doesn't tip, and what I've also done is I put a stop here at the back, so when I route across and it stops there, that stops in exactly the same position that I'm looking for. Now this setup will work for the inner face of the left hand panel and the right face of the centre panel, because that cuts in exactly the same way. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this in this orientation. I can take this piece of stock out. Because I've got the flag stop in place, I can bring the next one in to the same flag stop, make the same cut using the same stop points on the back of the rail, and everything will come out perfectly aligned. Now the setup doesn't work in the right hand face because that comes from the back to this point, where this one comes from the back to that point. They're mirror images of each other. But I can use the same technique and just reset up for the next cut. So I'm going to go ahead and make the cut for the left hand inner face and the centre right hand face. Now it's not the marking out that gives me the accuracy, it's the setup of the fences and the reference points that gives me the accuracy. I mark it out simply so I know I'm cutting in the right place because it's easy to get confused with the stock. Now before I actually cut into the live wood, I just want to make a test cut in a scrap piece of wood, and that's purely to look at the fit. That's made a beautiful clean cut, which is great. And that is absolutely beautiful, tight as you like. That will glue up nicely and be super strong. So I think we're pretty good to go. In case you're interested, the bit I've got inside the router is a 19.05mm bit from Axminster. It's part of their Excalibur range, not super expensive, but does a beautiful clean cut. I'm going to check myself to make sure nothing's moved. My stock is against my flag stop, which is nice. I'm still on that centre point, and my stop position is nice and tight, and that looks good. So let's go ahead and make this cut. Bring in the next piece of stock, slide that up to my flag stop, put this down, check my markings to make sure I'm in the correct orientation, and I am here. And now I can go ahead and make this cut. And now just to test myself, if I line these two pieces of stock up from the top, this joint here should line up perfectly. And it does, so we're in good shape. Okay, so that's the first cut on my left one done. So I'm going to put that out of the way and bring in the right one. And you can see the other side of my centre panel is exactly the same cut. Hope this is making sense. So I'm still using my flag stop here to give me exactly the same position from top to bottom. And I'm still using the same alignment on the jig in terms of the centre point, so I don't need to rework those. But what I want to do now is to just set my end stop so it's at this end of the cut. And that looks good about there, so I can come in with my stop and just mark that position. Now I do want to avoid tear out at this back joint there. I'm going to make a small cut here coming into the stock just to avoid tear out on the back end. Then lift the router up, come back to this end, plunge down and then make the cut, and that'll just stop tear out in this back edge. Now we can bring these together, you can see what I was talking about. This is a left-hand panel, the inner face, and this is a centre panel that's going to face off against it in that sort of orientation. And if I bring these in together and I line up the top and the bottom of the stock, this joint here lines up beautifully running across it, which means my shelf is going to be parallel. If I turn the centre panel over and expose the other side, and bring this piece in, line up the top and the bottom, like so, that also lines up perfectly. And because I centered the line here, you can see the top cut is directly on the marks that we made, so we're in good shape. Everything lines up, everything's going to be beautifully square. And that's how you do it. That's how you cut the stop dados in the shelf using your MFT table and an appropriate router. Now you can see why I bothered to build an MFT table and set everything up nice and square, because it makes that sort of joinery super duper easier. If you've not got that, you can actually use straight edges and clamp those down in different places, make sure they're all square, and you can achieve the same thing. But you know, with an MFT, a rail attachment for your router, a couple of stop blocks, it makes the job super easy. So now I do exactly the same for the next one down. This one starts at 371 down, so it'll be 380.5 to the center. And then there's one at the bottom here that's 684 down. So I'm going to go ahead and use exactly the same technique to cut those. Bear in mind this one's narrower, this one was 130 long, the next one is 105 long, but that's just a case of moving the stop blocks around. I'm going to crack on and get that done, and we'll come back together and look at shaping these panels up. Okay, so that's that joinery done. Super fast, super simple. And the idea of not putting the shaping in at that point hopefully makes sense, because you can just work to those square parallel edges. Now, this is what I end up with. This is the right hand side, the center panel, and the left hand side. And you can see that that's a mirror image. And what you're looking for, once you've got your panels lined up, these here should all be lined up and all be flush with each other. So when that one goes on its end there, on the right hand side of your cabinet, and this one goes like that, everything is going to be nice and square. And similarly, the center left and the left panel should also be mirror images of themselves, and everything, oops, should also line up. And if you do that and you take the time on that joinery, then when you come to put the cabinet together, it will self-square. There'll be no slopes or twists in the shelves. Perfect, good, happy with that. Now you can see that my panels actually have a bit of shape to them. You don't need to put the shape in it, it just sort of kind of looks pretty. And the techniques you're actually learning here by doing this, you're actually making almost one of those wall-mounted plate racks where you can see ornaments and plates sitting here quite nicely. So it's actually quite a nice piece of furniture that we're making. But my next job is I want to put these profiles in onto these pieces. Now if you look at this, you can see the front curve here on the profile, but you can see there's these cutouts here and here at the bottom that are 18mm in from the back of this stock, and that's to allow for the backing of this to sit flush to the wall without ugly gaps inside it. So the front is pretty freeform, we can do what we want with that, and we'll look at that in a second, but the back is quite precise to allow things to fit together. So I'm going to turn over my cabinet, so I'm going to put my left piece there with the back facing up, my right piece here with the back facing up, and the center piece here with the back facing up. And now I'm going to use what's known as proportional dimensioning to make sure that everything is looking good. And proportional dimensioning sounds great, but it's nothing clever, it's just using the stock to make sure we're in alignment. So this piece of stock goes on the bottom here. We've already cut this earlier on, and that wants to line up flush with the bottom of those panels. Now according to that diagram, our cutout wants to end at the top of the internal shelf, so it's actually hidden behind the shelf. Ensuring I'm flush, I just draw a line across these pieces. You can see that I am indeed just on the top of that gap, just on the top of that shelf, which is where I want it. So that's quite an easy measurement. I know that all of these want to line up with that top piece there. Now the top piece is a bit more complicated because you remember we made it into two sections. We've got configured at the top part here a French cleat to hold it to the wall, and then we've got a large backing panel here. So I'm going to come in with the French cleat first of all. Now this French cleat at the top here goes on in that orientation, with the top of the French cleat being flush with the top here, so you can see the slope is on the inside. Now for belt and braces, I want to actually make that gap a little bit wider, just a little bit wider. So I'm just going to mark this off across here where that's going to go, like so. But you can see that the three marks we just made don't really line up. I'm not surprised, because I was wrestling a large piece of wood around on stock that was wobbling. My worst case scenario, looking at these three lines, is this one. That's going to be the tightest fit to the top because it's the one that's furthest to that end. So I'm going to work on that one, and I'm going to take that worst case scenario down this stock by about 5mm or so. And then I'm going to score a line across there, like that. And now we know we're going to take this piece down here by 18mm. Just check the final thickness of our stock, and it has indeed come in at 18mm. So there you go. I now know I want to cut out this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, and this piece. Now there's a variety of ways you could do that. You could do it with a handsaw. You could probably do it with table saw, but just make sure you're aware where the curve of the blade is. You could do it with a jigsaw, or you could do it with a bandsaw. I think the easiest way for us to actually do this is actually going to be with the bandsaw. So I'm going to go over to the bandsaw now and make this cut. So using that mark that we've just made, I'm just going to line up my rip fence into that cut, which is looking about there, and then I'm very carefully going to feed my stock through the cut, making sure that this edge stays flush against the fence. The reason I'm doing it that way, if I get this wrong and I tend to wander away from the fence, that's going to cut into this waste. There's no way, unless my blade is really out of true in the calibration, there's no way I can cut into the good stock. When I get to this end, because that distance is now set, I can simply flip the stock over and come into this piece. So I'll cut all these pieces out first of all, and then I'll just come back in and cross cut these small pieces here. Okay, let's do that. And with that done, and if our work's been halfway decent, that should all fit in quite nicely, with everything being flush, and this piece here, simulating the wall, should drop in and just happily slide into position. And look at that. So I'm happy with that. So once all this is glued up and it's all squared up, there's a slightest piece of sanding on these parts just to bring it flush, but that's good. Yeah, and that's very good. I'm very happy with that. In fact, it's almost professional. Love it. Cool. Next job is let's put those elegant curves on the front. Let's see what we're going to do. Now, don't follow the plans for this. Have a bit of fun with it. So that's what we're going to have a look at. Now, you don't actually need to do this, because if this is purely functional and you don't want to put these pretty curves in, you don't have to. Just keep it like this and glue the thing together at this point. Now, the top part of this is already this distance here. It's already set for us. And all I'm doing is I'm bringing in this bottom part just so it's slightly in front of the shelves. So all I care about really is the distance from the front of the shelf to what's going to be the front of the cabinet. Now, if you remember, we cut these grooves at 105 long, but I took the reference point from the back edge that have now cut off. So those grooves that were at 105 are now not at 105. But the shelves indeed are 105. So if I now mark 105 from our new back, you can see my shelf is going to come out to this point here. And in fact, here is one of the shelves, and I've already cut it ready to go, and you can see that's going to fit in there nicely, and that's where the front of the shelf is going to come in. Now, don't worry about this and how I cut this out. We'll look at that shortly and the ways of doing that, but you just want it for demonstration. So I want something that's going to come out round about here, and I think somewhere round about there, about 10mm or so, I think is going to look quite nice. So we know our shelf's going to be 105, so yeah, I'm going to make the front of my shelf here 115. From that point and that point. And that's purely something that's going to look nice and pretty. I then want to transition up into something here. So I want some sort of shape that's going to curve up and curve out, sort of like that. So I'll just use the bottom of my coffee cup. There you go, to make that sort of profile. So I can now simply cut that out again on the bandsaw, which is quite nice, I think. So I'm going to use a similar technique that we use for the back edge. I'm going to set the rip fence up to give me round about this cut, and that will do the majority of the work for us up until this point here. And then I'll also use a bandsaw to freehand this out here, and if it's look pants, we'll then use the drum sander just to bring that down to a pleasing shape. However, what I think I'll do, I'm going to stick all these together with carpet tape, and I'm going to cut them all at the same time, and that way I'm going to get a consistent shape. Now, as long as we've got these three faces here flush and the tops and the bottoms flush, this should work pretty well. Let's give it a go. And what you end up with is something like that. So that's as far as I want to go today. In the next video, we're going to look at how I made these black shelves, how we glued this up, and the final finish on this project. See you soon.